Here are my flashcards. Here are my slides. Alright. So, this is Persuasive Speech for Public Speaking. My name is Carter Stegmeyer, and for my audience today, I have my mom. So, go ahead and get started. For my persuasive speech, I'm going to talk about violent video games. So close your eyes and imagine the violent game I'm about to describe to you. In this game, you're set loose upon the world to cause as much mayhem or destruction as you want. In this game, you're allowed to murder, burn, and drown innocent animals, civilians, and shopkeepers with no negative repercussions to the player. This might seem like a violent game for teens and adults. But actually, this game is for all audiences, even younger children. It's one of the most popular games of the last decade. The game I'm talking about is Minecraft. In my speech, I'm going to persuade you that violent video games do not cause the people who play them to become violent in real life. Now, all my life, I've been playing a wide variety of games. I've done a lot of research, so I'm qualified to tell you and persuade you that violent video games do not cause violence in real life, because not all games that are considered violent are inherently violent games themselves, because the research on violent video games is misleading, and because violent video games are a scapegoat rather than the actual cause of violence. Now, for my first point, I need to clarify that, as you can see from my my introduction, Minecraft is a very family-friendly game for all audiences, but depending on how you describe it, could seem like a very violent, mature game. And that's why I need to clarify between cartoon or fantasy violence, as pictured here, where it's very unrealistic, and those who are harmed usually don't stay that way, unrealistic, usually for comedic effect. And what can be described as graphic violence, which is represented here, which is violence that is much more realistic, it's intense, and it's intended to be as real as possible, sometimes even disturbing. So, in the talk about violence in video games, it's understood that we're talking about graphic violence in these cases. Games that are using cartoon or fantasy violence are not part of the discussion, and even according to Sonia Gabriel from a Proceedings of the European Conference of Games-Based Learning, they're even used in schools. For example, Minecraft primarily is used in schools as a teaching instrument to help younger students understand basic concepts. And Daniel Kofler put it best in an article titled Media Violence, that depending on how far you take the definition, even the mild-mannered Super Mario Bros. Can be considered graphic violence. So it's important to keep that in mind as we move forward in the speech. Now you might be thinking, the cartoon or fantasy violence shown in games might not be an issue, but what about the graphic violence that is shown in games? Could that be causing violence in real life? Well, that brings me to my second point, where we discuss the research on violent video games. Now, research on violent video games is very misleading, because what they're actually researching are aggressive thoughts, feelings, and sometimes actions. Now, the reason for this is that there are certain research principles and ethics that they have to follow when conducting research like this. And according to principles of research ethics by Laird dissertation, the first principle, most important, is to always minimize the harm to participants in your research. So if we can't actually conduct research that could harm or could lead to violence, how can we be sure that video games are actually causing violence? It's a large leap to say that aggressive thoughts or feelings could actually lead to a violent act. And that brings up an interesting point for the defense, which is that it was put best by Alice Ireland in an article called "The Learning Impact of Violent Video Games," where it discusses a theory called the catharsis theory that suggests that playing violent video games could be a healthy release for aggressive feelings, thoughts, even stress. So by playing these violent games, you have a healthy outlet and could even reduce the violence that might occur in real life. Now, maybe you're not convinced. Maybe you say, there's so many people in the media, even important political figures, that are telling us that violent video games are inspiring young people to commit violent acts in real life. And that brings me to my third point, where I'll be discussing video games as a scapegoat. Now, in the past, things like comic books, violent movies like Rambo or the Terminator, and even rock and roll music was blamed for causing violent acts and crime among youth. But all these, including video games, are merely acting as a red herring. It's much easier for someone to say something like comic books or violent video games are causing violence to end the discussion there, rather than try and theorize why violence is actually occurring. Now, you might be saying, there's just no way. I'm totally not convinced, and I'm not going to change my mind. And that will bring me to my last bit of support, where I will explain to you how, if there was an actual relationship between violent video games and violence in real life and crime, then as the video game industry has grown over the past 20, 30 years, we would have seen a relationship in the amount of violence and crime heading in the same direction. But in fact, the opposite is true. According to a report by Forbes, Ilkor Koskol says that the video game industry is approaching a $300 billion a year revenue. But according to John Gramlich, in an article by the Pew Research Center, crime over the past 30 years has taken a sharp decline and is the lowest it's been in decades. Now, if there were a relationship between violent video games and violence in real life, crime, we would have seen the numbers go up together or go down together. But instead, the inverse is true. And that will bring me to the conclusion of my speech. Now, I want to remind you that the scope of this speech was not to discuss what the real life causes of violence were, or what brings people to actually commit violent acts. I'm simply trying to persuade you that video games are not the cause of violence. Over the course of my speech, I told you about how violent video games might not necessarily be violent inherently, just that they're called that by the mere definition. That the research around violent video games is misleading, and that they might actually lead to decreased levels of violence. And that violent video games are merely acting as a scapegoat rather than trying to shift the discussion towards real causes of violence. And that is the end of my speech.